Elijah Carter was 48 years old and still woke up before sunrise every morning because silence was cheaper than alarms. The small house he rented on the south side of Atlanta creaked softly when he stepped across the hallway in worn work boots, careful not to wake his daughter upstairs before school. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the old black pickup truck parked beside a crooked mailbox with peeling paint. The truck looked one bad winter away from dying completely. Most people in the neighborhood thought Elijah was the same way. Just another tired black mechanic trying to survive month to month with grease on his hands and overdue bills in his kitchen drawer. But every morning, he still packed his daughter Ava's lunch before touching his own coffee. Peanut butter sandwich. Apple slices. A folded note inside the lunchbox that always ended the same way. Proud of you. Love, Dad. The fluorescent lights inside Carter Auto Repair buzzed softly by 7:30 every morning. Elijah spent most days beneath lifted trucks and leaking engines while local customers complained about prices they already knew were fair. His old toolbox sat near the back wall beside faded family photos and oil-stained rags folded with military precision. Some people mistook his quietness for weakness. Others assumed he lacked ambition because he never wore expensive clothes or chased attention. Elijah let them think whatever helped them sleep easier. Across town, Victoria Hale lived in a different universe entirely. People lowered their voices when she entered rooms. Her real estate company owned half the luxury developments rising across Atlanta's skyline. Elegant. Precise. Controlled. She moved through marble lobbies and glass offices wearing tailored coats, expensive perfume, and the kind of confidence money taught people early. But even Victoria carried exhaustion now. The kind hidden beneath polished makeup and perfectly timed smiles. That Thursday afternoon, rain drifted steadily across the city when Victoria's black SUV rolled into Carter Auto Repair with a damaged front tire and a driver already irritated by the neighborhood. Elijah wiped grease from his hands with an old rag before walking outside beneath the gray sky. Victoria stepped out slowly from the back seat in a deep red coat over a cream-colored dress, heels touching wet pavement carefully. For a brief second, the garage lights reflected against the rain behind her like a scene from another life entirely. Elijah noticed the exhaustion in her eyes immediately. Not because she was beautiful. Because tired people recognized each other faster than anyone else. How long? Her driver asked impatiently while staring around the garage like he regretted stopping there. Elijah crouched near the damaged tire calmly. About 30 minutes if the rim is not bent. The driver sighed dramatically. Victoria barely looked at Elijah at first. To her, he was just another mechanic in an old garage with grease on his sleeves and rainwater darkening his work boots. But then she noticed something strange. Elijah stopped mid-sentence when Ava walked into the garage wearing her school backpack and holding a crumpled math test. His entire expression softened instantly. 93. Elijah smiled warmly while kneeling beside her. That is my girl. Ava grinned proudly before whispering something in his ear that made him laugh quietly for the first time all day. Victoria watched the moment longer than she intended to. Something about it felt steady. Real. The kind of warmth money never successfully copied. Then she noticed Elijah quietly handing Ava the last $10 from his wallet for a school field trip while pretending it was no big deal. His coffee nearby had already gone cold. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Just unfinished somehow. Before we go deeper into what he discovered that day, tell us where you are watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way everyone in that neighborhood looked at Elijah Carter. The rain grew heavier outside while Elijah replaced the damaged tire beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Victoria stood near the office window checking emails on her phone, but her attention kept drifting back toward him. She watched him help an elderly customer tighten a loose mirror for free. Watched him refuse extra cash from a delivery driver struggling to pay. Watched him quietly carry dignity the way other men carried anger. She kept watching. Then Elijah noticed something unusual himself. A black SUV had been parked across the street for nearly 20 minutes with its headlights off despite the rain. Another slowly turned the corner behind it. Dark windows. Expensive wheels. Silent engines. Elijah frowned slightly before returning to work. He had no idea what that small detail would reveal. But inside the garage office, Victoria looked through the rain-covered glass toward the growing line of black SUVs entering the neighborhood, and for the first time since arriving, she stopped seeing Elijah as just a mechanic. The rain had not stopped by closing time. Water slid slowly down the garage windows while fluorescent lights flickered softly above half-open toolboxes and stained concrete floors. Elijah Carter stood beneath the raised hood of an old Ford pickup with grease darkening the lines of his hands, but his attention kept drifting toward the street outside. 3 black SUVs now sat quietly across from the garage with engines running low. Nobody inside stepped out. Nobody moved. Ava noticed it too. She sat near the office desk finishing homework beside a bag of cold fries and a small carton of chocolate milk. "Dad," she whispered carefully, "those cars been there forever." Elijah looked through the rain again before wiping his hands on an oil rag. Probably lost. But even he did not believe it completely. Something about the stillness felt deliberate. Controlled. Victoria Hale remained inside the garage longer than necessary while her driver waited impatiently near the repaired SUV. She stood beside the office coffee machine with one arm folded across her waist, watching Elijah through reflections in the glass. Men usually performed around women like her. They straightened their posture. Changed their tone. Tried to impress her. Elijah never did. Even now, after hours of work and rain soaking through his old jacket earlier that afternoon, he moved with the same quiet steadiness. No performance. No bitterness. Just responsibility. Victoria found herself noticing details she normally ignored. The careful way he stacked Ava's school papers so they would not wrinkle. The way he quietly covered a stray leak from the ceiling with a bucket before water touched a customer's tires. The way neighborhood kids passing outside waved at him through the rain like he belonged to something larger than the garage itself. Then the oldest SUV door finally opened. A tall man in a dark coat stepped onto the wet pavement carrying an umbrella but did not approach immediately. He simply stood there looking toward the garage entrance as if confirming something. Elijah felt Ava move closer beside him. "Do you know him?" she asked softly. Elijah narrowed his eyes slightly. No, but somewhere deep in his memory, something stirred anyway. A highway. Rain. A frightened teenage boy sitting beneath a broken bus stop 11 years earlier. The feeling vanished before he could fully catch it. Victoria watched Elijah's expression shift for only half a second. She noticed because powerful people survived by reading rooms quickly. And whatever crossed Elijah's face just then was not fear. It was recognition trying to wake up. The man across the street finally began walking toward the garage slowly while the remaining SUVs stayed behind him like shadows. Expensive shoes stepped through puddles carefully. The neighborhood outside had grown strangely quiet. Curtains moved inside nearby houses. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Everyone noticed the SUVs now. Elijah calmly lowered the hood of the truck before stepping forward. No panic. No aggression. Just quiet caution. Ava instinctively held the edge of his work jacket. The child saw what everyone else missed. Elijah's left hand trembled slightly before becoming still again. Victoria noticed that too. Her driver muttered under his breath. "This place got some strange business tonight." But Victoria did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Elijah standing beneath the buzzing garage lights with rainwater dripping near his boots and grease still marking his sleeves. For the first time in years, she found herself genuinely curious about a man with no visible power at all. The stranger stopped just outside the garage entrance. Water rolled down the black umbrella as he stared directly at Elijah for several silent seconds. Then his eyes moved toward the old faded toolbox near the back wall. Something changed in his expression immediately. Not surprise. Something deeper. Emotional. Like someone looking at a photograph they thought no longer existed. Elijah followed the man's gaze toward the toolbox automatically. An old sticker remained attached near the bottom corner. Faded letters. Barely visible now beneath years of scratches and oil stains. The stranger smiled faintly through the rain before speaking in a quiet voice that made Elijah's chest tighten unexpectedly. You still kept it. Everything changed after that moment. Rainwater rolled steadily down the garage windows while silence settled heavily across Carter Auto Repair. Even the fluorescent lights seemed quieter now. Elijah Carter stood motionless near the old toolbox as the stranger lowered his umbrella beside the entrance. Up close, the man looked somewhere in his early 30s now. Sharp black coat. Expensive watch. Calm posture shaped by years of learning how powerful people entered rooms. But his eyes carried something Elijah recognized instantly. Loneliness that had once learned how to survive cold nights alone. Ava stayed close beside her father while Victoria Hale watched from near the office doorway, one hand resting lightly against the glass frame. Nobody inside the garage understood why the air suddenly felt emotional before a single explanation had even been spoken. The stranger glanced once more toward the faded sticker attached to Elijah's toolbox. A small cartoon astronaut peeling away beneath years of oil and scratches. Elijah slowly exhaled through his nose. Then he remembered. 11 years earlier. Rain hitting a broken bus stop beside Interstate 20. A frightened white teenage boy sitting alone with a swollen lip, soaked backpack, and nowhere to go. Elijah had been driving home from a double shift that night when he noticed him under the flickering highway light. Most drivers kept moving. Elijah had pulled over anyway. Daniel? Elijah said quietly now. The man smiled immediately despite the emotion rising in his face. Yeah. Ava looked between them with confusion while Victoria unconsciously stepped closer. Daniel Whitmore glanced around the garage slowly as if searching for pieces of the past still surviving inside the room. You still got the same smell in here, he said softly. Oil. Coffee. Rain. Elijah almost laughed under his breath. Means business still bad. Daniel shook his head gently. No. Means some things stayed real. The words hung quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. Victoria watched Elijah carefully then. Something in his posture had changed. Not fear. Not nervousness. Just memory opening old doors he normally kept shut. Daniel's eyes drifted toward Ava. Your daughter. Elijah nodded once. Ava. Daniel smiled warmly at her. Your dad saved my life once. Ava looked up at Elijah immediately. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the stained concrete floor instead of responding. That alone told Victoria more than any speech could have. Men who performed kindness usually spoke about it first chance they got. Elijah looked almost uncomfortable hearing it mentioned aloud. Outside, neighbors still peeked through curtains toward the line of black SUVs parked silently along the curb. Something felt unreal about expensive vehicles waiting outside a struggling garage in the middle of a working-class neighborhood. Victoria noticed her own driver staring through the office window now too. Daniel reached slowly inside his coat pocket before pulling out a folded photograph protected inside clear plastic. He handed it carefully to Elijah. The image was faded from years of carrying. Elijah standing beside the old black truck during that storm 11 years earlier. Younger. Tired. Holding out a cup of gas station coffee toward teenage Daniel beneath the rain. Ava stared at the photo quietly. Dad, she whispered softly. Elijah looked embarrassed more than proud. That old thing still around? Daniel nodded slowly. I kept it the whole time. Victoria could not stop watching Elijah's face now. She saw something there hidden beneath years of grease stains, overdue bills, and quiet labor. A man who had once helped somebody without expecting the world to notice. Daniel looked around the garage again before his eyes settled on the worn coffee machine near the office. "You told me something that night," he said quietly. Elijah frowned slightly as if struggling to remember. Daniel smiled faintly. "I tried paying you back for the motel room and food." Ava looked confused again. Victoria's expression tightened with curiosity. Rain tapped softly against the roof while every person inside the garage leaned unconsciously closer to the memory unfolding between them. Daniel's voice lowered almost emotionally then. "And you looked at me and said, 'Pay me when you are rich.'" The garage fell completely silent after that. For a few seconds nobody inside Carter Auto Repair moved at all. Rain tapped softly against the roof while fluorescent lights hummed above the stained concrete floor. Daniel Whitmore stood near the garage entrance with water still clinging to the shoulders of his black coat, but the expensive SUVs outside no longer felt important. The entire room had shifted around one sentence spoken 11 years earlier beside a highway bus stop. Elijah Carter looked down at the faded photograph in his hands again before sliding it carefully back toward Daniel. "You kept all this time?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Some people save stock certificates. I saved proof somebody cared whether I lived or not." Ava looked between the two men with widening eyes while Victoria Hale remained near the office doorway, completely still now. The elegant confidence she carried when arriving earlier had softened into something quieter. Human curiosity mixed with guilt. Because only an hour ago she had mentally reduced Elijah to a struggling mechanic with worn boots and a leaking roof over his garage. Now she was beginning to realize she had walked into the middle of a story much larger than appearances. Daniel slowly removed his gloves while looking around the garage again. "You gave me your couch for almost 3 weeks, he said softly. Elijah rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "You were a kid." "I was trouble," Daniel corrected gently. "Everybody else said so." Elijah gave a faint shrug. "Everybody else was tired." Victoria noticed the difference immediately. Most people explained kindness by praising themselves. Elijah explained it by excusing everyone else. That unsettled her more than she expected. Ava stepped closer to the toolbox while Daniel crouched slightly to her level. "Your dad still make pancakes shaped like bad footballs?" he asked. Ava blinked in surprise before laughing softly. "Every Saturday." Elijah shook his head under his breath. "They are not bad." Daniel smiled fully for the first time. "Still lying to yourself after all these years?" The warmth inside the room changed subtly then. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to soften the tension that had filled the garage since the SUVs arrived. But Victoria kept noticing something else too. Daniel carried himself like a man people listened to now. Even the men waiting inside the SUVs outside watched him carefully through rain-covered windows. Expensive watches. Earpieces. Tailored coats. Power surrounded him naturally. Yet standing inside that old garage, Daniel looked at Elijah with the kind of respect powerful men rarely gave anyone. Elijah walked toward the coffee machine quietly before pouring another cup into a chipped mug stained from years of use. "Coffee still terrible," he muttered while offering it toward Daniel automatically. Daniel accepted it immediately without hesitation. "Best coffee I ever had." Victoria almost smiled despite herself. The driver beside her looked confused by the entire scene now. Nobody could understand why wealthy men with black SUVs had arrived at a struggling garage just to stand quietly around a mechanic drinking cheap coffee. But the child saw what everyone else missed again. Ava noticed Daniel looking toward Elijah the same way children look toward fathers after surviving something painful. Outside, more porch lights flicked on across the neighborhood. Phones glowed behind curtains. People whispered while rain rolled along the curb beside the silent line of SUVs. Something important was happening inside Carter Auto Repair, even if nobody fully understood what yet. Then Daniel slowly reached inside his coat pocket again and removed a folded envelope sealed carefully in plastic against the rain. Elijah's expression changed slightly the moment he saw it. Not fear. Recognition. The envelope looked old. Worn around the edges like it had traveled for years. Daniel held it gently for a moment before speaking again. You probably forgot this too. Elijah stared quietly at the envelope while Victoria instinctively stepped closer from the office doorway. Rainwater dripped steadily from the garage roof outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. And somewhere deep inside his chest, Elijah suddenly remembered the exact night he wrote his name on that envelope with hands still shaking from exhaustion. Elijah Carter stared at the old envelope in Daniel Whitmore's hand while rainwater slid slowly down the garage windows behind them. The paper looked fragile now. Yellowed around the edges. Folded and unfolded too many times across too many years. For a moment Elijah did not reach for it. He already remembered what was inside. A handwritten address. A phone number. $20 folded between notebook paper because it was all he had left that week. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while Ava leaned against the office desk watching her father carefully. Victoria Hale remained near the doorway with her arms folded loosely now, no longer carrying the cold distance she arrived with earlier that afternoon. Daniel stepped closer before handing Elijah the envelope gently. You gave me this the morning I left, he said quietly. Elijah finally took it with rough mechanic hands still stained faintly with oil. He looked almost uncomfortable holding his own kindness again after all these years. I told you not to come back if you got mixed up in trouble again, Elijah muttered softly. Daniel smiled faintly. That part definitely stayed with me. Victoria watched Elijah lower his eyes toward the floor after saying it. There was no pride in him. No dramatic satisfaction seeing someone successful return. Only the quiet awkwardness of a man who never expected anybody to remember what he did during ordinary hard days. Outside, thunder rolled low across Atlanta while black SUVs remained lined along the curb like silent witnesses. Neighborhood curtains still shifted behind glowing windows. People were watching. But inside the garage, the world had narrowed down to old memories and unfinished gratitude. Daniel glanced toward the faded family photographs hanging beside the toolbox. One picture showed Ava years younger sitting inside the same old truck with missing front hubcaps and an oversized winter coat. Another showed Elijah standing beside a broken engine holding a birthday cake with mechanic gloves still on his hands. Daniel smiled softly at the images. You know what I remembered most? He asked quietly. Elijah shook his head once. You treated me normal. The sentence settled heavily in the room. Victoria looked down briefly because she suddenly realized how rarely powerful people treated struggling men that way. Especially men like Elijah. Working class. Quiet. Invisible to most of the city until they needed something repaired. Daniel continued carefully. Everybody else looked at me like I was already gone. You did not. Elijah leaned against the workbench beside the toolbox while rain tapped harder against the roof now. You were just hungry, he said simply. People get mean when they are hungry. Victoria almost stopped breathing for a second after hearing that. Because Elijah did not describe pain with bitterness. He described it with understanding. That difference changed something inside her she could not fully explain yet. Ava slowly walked toward Daniel then. Were you really homeless? She asked carefully. Daniel crouched slightly so his voice stayed gentle. For a little while. Ava frowned softly. My dad would never let somebody stay hungry. Elijah looked embarrassed immediately. Ava. But Daniel smiled warmly. She is right. Silence returned again after that. Warm. Emotional. Heavy without becoming dramatic. Then Victoria noticed something else sitting partially exposed inside the open envelope Elijah still held. A small motel receipt. The date printed across the top was 11 years old. Paid in cash. She saw Elijah instinctively try to slide it deeper into the envelope before anyone else noticed. Too late. Her eyes already caught the amount. More money than a struggling mechanic should have spent helping a stranger during hard years. Daniel noticed her reaction immediately. He paid for a room when nobody else would rent to me, he said quietly. Elijah sighed beneath his breath. You needed sleep. You needed money, Daniel corrected softly. The garage grew silent again after that. Even Ava looked toward her father differently now. Not shocked. Proud. But Elijah still refused to look at anyone directly. Instead he reached automatically for the old coffee pot again, as if returning to ordinary routines could somehow hide the weight of old sacrifices. Then Victoria noticed one final detail inside the envelope. A folded business card with Elijah's handwriting across the back. 3 simple words written in faded blue ink. If things worsen. Elijah Carter stared quietly at the faded handwriting on the back of the old business card while rain continued sliding down the garage windows behind him. If things worsen. 3 simple words written during a winter when he barely had enough money to survive himself. His rough thumb brushed lightly across the ink as if touching a version of himself he no longer fully remembered. Ava leaned closer beside him while Victoria Hale remained silent near the office doorway, unable to pull her attention away from the man she had completely misjudged only hours earlier. Daniel Whitmore watched Elijah carefully, then smiled with something close to sadness. I called that number once, he admitted softly. Elijah looked up slowly. Middle of the night. Daniel nodded. You answered on the second ring. Elijah gave a faint shrug. I was working late. But Daniel shook his head immediately. No. You were waiting. The garage grew still again after that. Even the rain seemed softer for a moment. Victoria felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest because she suddenly understood the hidden loneliness inside Elijah's life. Men like him carried entire worlds quietly without anybody noticing. They stayed awake for other people while nobody stayed awake for them. Elijah walked toward the workbench and placed the envelope carefully beside the old toolbox before reaching for another rag automatically. Routine protected him whenever emotions became too visible. Victoria recognized that instinct immediately because she carried her own version of it behind polished business meetings and expensive dinners. Daniel slowly looked around the garage again. You still fixing everything yourself? Elijah nodded once while tightening a loose wrench onto the wall rack. Cannot afford not to. Daniel glanced upward toward the leaking section of roof dripping steadily into a bucket near the back office. You should have called me years ago. Elijah gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath. For what? Daniel stared at him carefully then. For anything. Elijah finally looked directly at him for the first time since the conversation began. The fluorescent lights reflected softly against his tired eyes while grease stains darkened the edges of his sleeves. That was never the deal. Victoria felt the weight of those words immediately. Elijah had helped Daniel expecting absolutely nothing back. Not loyalty. Not money. Not future favors. Just survival. In her world, every kindness usually came attached to invisible contracts. Elijah seemed to operate by completely different rules. Ava slowly opened the small refrigerator beside the office desk before pulling out an extra soda can. She walked carefully toward Daniel and handed it to him shyly. Dad says people think better when they eat or drink something first. Daniel accepted it with a smile that looked dangerously close to breaking into tears. Your dad says a lot of smart things. Elijah shook his head again while pretending to focus on tools instead of emotions filling the room. Outside, another SUV slowly pulled up behind the others. Neighbors now stood openly beneath porches pretending not to stare. Victoria's driver checked his watch repeatedly near the office entrance, but she ignored him completely. Her expensive meetings downtown no longer felt important tonight. Something deeper was unfolding inside this old garage under flickering lights and rain-soaked ceilings. Then Daniel reached toward the inside pocket of his coat one more time. This time he removed a thin leather folder sealed carefully beneath clear plastic. Elijah's expression changed almost immediately the moment he saw it. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Daniel noticed. "I figured you would react like that." Victoria watched both men closely now. The atmosphere shifted again. Heavier this time. More personal. Daniel placed the folder gently onto the workbench beside the old envelope and faded toolbox. "I found this 2 years ago," he said quietly. "At a courthouse storage archive during a property acquisition." Elijah did not touch the folder. He simply stared at it while rainwater dripped steadily outside the garage. Ava looked confused again. Victoria stepped unconsciously closer from the doorway. Then Daniel slowly turned the folder toward Elijah so everyone could see the name typed across the top page beneath the plastic cover. Carter Auto Repair. Past due final notice. The old garage suddenly felt smaller after Daniel Whitmore placed the courthouse folder onto the workbench. Rain hammered harder against the roof now while fluorescent lights flickered softly above the rows of hanging tools and stained concrete floor. Elijah Carter stared silently at the words printed across the document as if they belonged to somebody else entirely. Carter Auto Repair. Past due final notice. Ava looked toward her father immediately, sensing the weight behind his silence even if she did not fully understand it yet. Victoria Hale slowly stepped closer from the office doorway, heels clicking softly against the concrete floor while the scent of rain and motor oil filled the room around her. Daniel kept his voice calm. "I almost did not believe it when I found the file." Elijah finally looked up from the folder. "You should not have dug into that." Daniel gave a faint smile filled more with sadness than humor. "You spent months making sure I stayed alive. I think that earned me the right to care what happened to you." Elijah rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw before turning toward the leaking roof again. Routine. Deflection. Survival. Victoria noticed how naturally he moved away from attention whenever emotion became too direct. It was not pride. It was habit built from years of carrying hardship privately so his daughter never had to carry it with him. Outside, the line of black SUVs stretched almost the full length of the curb now. Neighborhood children stood beneath nearby porches pretending to chase rainwater while secretly staring toward the garage. Adults lingered near windows holding coffee cups and whispering quietly about the powerful-looking visitors surrounding Elijah's tiny repair shop. Something felt unreal about wealth arriving so silently into a place built entirely from struggle. Daniel opened the courthouse folder carefully while avoiding water dripping from the roof nearby. Inside sat years of notices Elijah never mentioned to anyone. Tax extensions. Late payments. Repair liens. Property warnings. Victoria watched Elijah's expression closely while Daniel turned each page. There was no shame in Elijah's face. Only exhaustion. The quiet kind that accumulated slowly over decades without ever asking permission first. Ava stepped beside her father instinctively and wrapped one hand around his wrist. Elijah looked down at her immediately, his expression softening in the same way Victoria noticed earlier that afternoon. "It is all right," he told her gently. But Ava looked unconvinced. "Are they taking the garage?" The question landed heavily inside the room. Daniel answered before Elijah could. "Not anymore." Elijah shot him a quick glance immediately. Not angry. Cautious. Victoria noticed that too. Daniel leaned one hand against the old workbench beside the toolbox. The property was scheduled for acquisition 18 months ago. Victoria frowned slightly because now she recognized the legal structure. She had seen hundreds of files like this through her own real estate empire. Quiet buyouts. Redevelopment projects. Working-class neighborhoods slowly erased beneath polished investment language. Daniel continued carefully. The company trying to absorb the block folded before the transfer finalized. Elijah crossed his arms slowly. Good. Daniel looked directly at him then. It was one of my acquisitions. Silence returned instantly. Even the rain outside seemed distant for one suspended moment. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Ava looked confused again. Elijah remained completely still beside the workbench while fluorescent light reflected softly across the grease stains on his sleeves. You? Elijah asked quietly. Daniel nodded once. I stopped at the second I saw your name attached to the property. Victoria felt something shift sharply inside her chest then. Because suddenly the black SUVs outside made sense. The expensive coats. The security teams. The respect in Daniel's posture. Elijah had unknowingly once saved a man who now possessed the power to erase entire city blocks with signatures and contracts. But Elijah himself still stood there in old boots beneath a leaking roof holding a rag darkened with motor oil. Daniel slowly closed the folder before speaking again. You saved my life during the worst winter I ever knew. His voice lowered almost emotionally. I am not letting anybody take this place from you. Then the garage office printer suddenly activated by itself with a loud mechanical hum, startling Ava slightly. Victoria turned toward the office window instinctively. A new document had started printing from the old machine even though nobody touched it. The sudden sound of the old office printer broke through the silence like a memory refusing to stay buried. Everyone inside Carter Auto Repair turned instinctively toward the small office near the back wall where fluorescent light spilled across dusty filing cabinets and faded invoices pinned beside a crooked calendar. Ava jumped slightly before gripping the sleeve of Elijah Carter's work jacket tighter. Rainwater continued sliding down the windows while the printer slowly pushed out page after page with mechanical groans that sounded too loud for the quiet room. Elijah frowned immediately. That thing barely works. Daniel Whitmore glanced toward one of the men standing near the garage entrance. The man gave a small nod but never stepped forward. Victoria Hale noticed the exchange instantly. Somebody had remotely connected to the garage system. Somehow that realization made the atmosphere feel even stranger. More intimate. More serious. Elijah walked slowly toward the office while grease-darkened boots echoed softly across concrete stained by years of labor. Victoria followed without realizing she had moved. Daniel stayed near the workbench beside the old toolbox, watching Elijah carefully like a man waiting for a difficult truth to finally arrive. The printer stopped. Silence returned except for rain and distant thunder rolling somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Elijah pulled the warm pages carefully from the tray and scanned the first line. His expression changed almost invisibly. But Victoria saw it. So did Daniel. Elijah lowered the papers slightly before exhaling through his nose. You should not have done this, he said quietly without looking up. Ava tried to peek at the pages but Elijah gently turned them downward before she could read anything. Daniel stepped closer slowly. You once told me survival is easier when somebody finally gives you breathing room. Elijah shook his head faintly. That was different. Daniel smiled sadly. Not to me. Victoria's eyes moved carefully between them while soft office light reflected against the rain outside. She suddenly realized nobody here was talking about money anymore. They were talking about dignity. About being seen during moments when life quietly cornered people into hopelessness. Elijah set the papers onto the desk beside stacks of overdue invoices and unpaid utility notices. Victoria caught only fragments before the pages settled. Mortgage balance cleared. Property lien removed. Immediate hold cancellation. Her breath caught slightly. Daniel had not just stopped the acquisition. He had erased the pressure crushing Elijah silently for years. Yet Elijah did not look relieved. He looked uncomfortable. Almost trapped by gratitude. Daniel, he said carefully, I never helped you expecting this. Daniel nodded immediately. I know. Then why do all this? Elijah asked softly. Daniel looked around the garage once more before answering. The leaking roof. The old coffee machine. Ava's backpack resting beside oil-stained textbooks. The faded astronaut sticker still attached to the toolbox. Because some debts are too human to pay back halfway. The words settled heavily inside Victoria's chest. She suddenly remembered every moment earlier that day when she mentally categorized Elijah as ordinary. Replaceable. Small. And now standing inside this old garage, she realized she had spent years surrounded by wealthy men who commanded fear while quietly lacking the kind of humanity Elijah carried naturally without effort. Ava finally looked up at her father again. Does this mean we are okay? Elijah turned toward her immediately. That question mattered more than every black SUV parked outside. More than documents. More than money. He knelt slowly beside her despite the stiffness in his back from long workdays and rested one grease-marked hand gently against her shoulder. We were already okay, he told her softly. Victoria felt her eyes sting unexpectedly after hearing that. Because he meant it. Even drowning in bills and exhaustion, Elijah still measured wealth differently from everyone else. Then one of the men near the entrance stepped inside holding a small sealed package protected from the rain. He handed it quietly toward Daniel before leaving again without a word. Daniel stared at the package for a moment before slowly placing it onto Elijah's workbench beside the old envelope and courthouse folder. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. What is that? Daniel looked directly at him then. Something I have been carrying for 11 years. Rain continued falling outside Carter Auto Repair while everyone inside stared at the small sealed package resting quietly beside the old toolbox. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting pale reflections across the wet concrete floor and the rows of worn tools hanging against the walls. Elijah Carter remained motionless beside the workbench, one hand still resting lightly on Ava's shoulder as if grounding himself before whatever came next. Victoria Hale stood near enough now to smell coffee gone cold beside stacks of unpaid invoices in the office behind them. Something about the room no longer felt ordinary. 11 years of silence had finally caught up to this garage tonight. Daniel Whitmore slowly reached for the package and peeled back the protective wrapping carefully, almost respectfully. Inside sat a dark wooden box no larger than a hardcover book. The edges looked worn from time. Elijah frowned immediately the moment he recognized it. No, he said quietly under his breath. Daniel looked at him. You remember it. Elijah nodded once without speaking further. Victoria noticed his posture shift again. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to emotional exhaustion. Daniel opened the box carefully. Inside rested an old silver watch with cracked leather straps and faded scratches across the glass face. Ava tilted her head slightly. It is broken. Elijah finally stepped closer. His eyes softened instantly after seeing the watch again beneath the fluorescent light. It stopped working years ago, he said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. You gave it to me anyway. Victoria watched both men carefully while thunder rolled somewhere outside the neighborhood. She sensed the story hiding beneath the object before either man explained it. Daniel lifted the watch gently from the box. You sold this to cover my motel room for another week. Elijah shook his head immediately. I did not sell it. You refused to take it back, Daniel corrected softly. Silence returned again. Ava stared up at her father with growing confusion. Grandpa's watch. Elijah nodded slowly. Victoria saw the pain behind his eyes then. Real pain. Old pain. The kind buried beneath work schedules and responsibility because survival never leaves enough time to grieve properly. Elijah carefully took the watch from Daniel's hand. His thumb brushed lightly across the cracked glass while rainwater streaked down the windows behind him. My father wore this every day, he admitted quietly. Even at the factory. Ava moved closer beside him immediately. Why did you give it away? Elijah stared at the stopped watch for several seconds before answering. Because somebody needed help more than I needed memories. Victoria felt something break open emotionally inside her chest after hearing that sentence. The garage suddenly looked different around her. The leaking roof. The old heater humming weakly near the office. The patched work jacket hanging beside the door. Elijah had sacrificed pieces of his own history quietly while the rest of the world kept assuming he had little value to give. Daniel folded his arms slowly. I carried that watch through every meeting afterward. Elijah looked confused. Daniel smiled slightly. Every boardroom. Every acquisition. Every flight. Victoria blinked softly. You carried that? Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off Elijah. It reminded me who I almost became before somebody treated me like a human being again. The rain outside softened slightly now, leaving only a steady tapping against the roof. One of the SUVs turned off its headlights near the curb, darkening part of the street beyond the garage windows. Inside, nobody moved for several quiet seconds. Then Ava carefully touched the cracked watch in her father's hand. Did Grandpa ever know? Elijah swallowed once before answering. No, his voice lowered almost to a whisper afterward. He passed away before things got better. Victoria looked away briefly after hearing that because suddenly the entire garage carried traces of inherited survival. Fathers building futures quietly for children who might never fully understand the cost until much later. Daniel slowly reached inside the wooden box one final time. Beneath the watch rested a folded yellowed photograph protected inside clear plastic. He handed it carefully toward Elijah. Elijah unfolded it slowly under the fluorescent light. Then his expression froze completely. Because standing beside his younger father in the photograph was a little boy no older than 8 years old. And beside them stood Daniel Whitmore. Elijah Carter stared silently at the old photograph beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while rainwater continued sliding down the garage windows behind him. The image trembled slightly between his rough fingers. Not because he was weak. Because memory had weight. Ava leaned closer beside him, trying to understand why her father suddenly looked like somebody standing face to face with a ghost from another lifetime. Victoria Hale remained completely still near the workbench, her expensive red coat draped over one arm now as if even she had forgotten the polished world waiting outside the garage. In the photograph, Elijah's father stood younger and smiling faintly beside a rusted factory fence. A little boy version of Elijah stood near him holding a soda bottle almost too large for his hands. And beside them stood Daniel Whitmore. Younger. Thinner. Wearing a winter coat several sizes too big. Elijah finally looked up slowly. Where did you get this? Daniel folded his arms quietly. Your father kept it. Elijah frowned slightly. That does not make sense. Daniel nodded once toward the photograph. Because you do not remember that day. Silence settled heavily again while thunder rolled softly outside the neighborhood. Elijah looked back down at the picture carefully. Victoria watched his eyes searching through fragments of old memory. Daniel stepped closer beside the workbench. I was 8 years old, he said quietly. My mother worked double shifts at the textile plant across town. Elijah remained silent. Daniel continued carefully. One winter she got sick. Real sick. Ava leaned softly against her father's side now while listening. We lost our apartment 2 weeks later. Victoria felt her chest tighten again because Daniel no longer sounded like the wealthy executive whose SUVs blocked the street outside. He sounded like somebody who had once known fear intimately. Daniel pointed gently toward Elijah's father in the photograph. Your dad used to bring extra sandwiches to the factory fence every Friday. Elijah's eyes slowly widened. Small pieces were finally returning now. Cold afternoons. Steam rising from factory vents. his father carrying brown paper bags inside his work jacket. He said nobody should feel invisible while hungry, Daniel whispered. Elijah lowered his head slightly after hearing that sentence because it sounded exactly like something his father would say. Daniel smiled faintly toward the old silver watch still resting beside the toolbox. Years later, when I showed up here with nowhere to go, I did not recognize you at first. Elijah swallowed quietly. But you recognized the watch. Daniel nodded. And your voice. Rain tapped softly against the roof while the garage fell silent again. Victoria suddenly understood something enormous hidden beneath the entire night. Elijah's kindness had not started with Daniel. It had been inherited. Passed quietly from father to son through years of sacrifice nobody applauded. Ava looked down at the photograph carefully. Grandpa helped him first. Daniel smiled warmly toward her. Your grandfather saved my mother more times than she ever knew. Elijah leaned one hand against the workbench as if the memories physically exhausted him. He never talked about any of this. Good men rarely do, Victoria said softly before realizing the words escaped her out loud. Everyone looked toward her briefly then. She almost looked embarrassed by her own honesty. Elijah met her eyes for only a second before looking back down at the photograph again. But something had changed between them now. The distance she carried earlier was gone completely. Outside, another wave of rain moved across the street while headlights reflected against puddles beside the parked SUVs. One of Daniel's drivers quietly brought fresh coffee into the office before leaving again without interrupting the moment. Daniel slowly reached into the wooden box once more. There is something else, he said carefully. Elijah looked up immediately. Daniel removed a folded document protected inside clear plastic and handed it toward him slowly. Elijah unfolded it beneath the fluorescent light while Victoria stepped unconsciously closer beside him. The paper was old. Signed. Official. At the very top sat the faded title Elijah never expected to see again. Factory Employee Emergency Beneficiary Record. And beneath the listed dependent names sat his father's signature beside one final handwritten line. If anything happens to me, help the Whitmore family first. The garage remained completely silent after Elijah Carter finished reading the faded beneficiary document beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Rain tapped steadily against the roof while the old heater hummed weakly near the office doorway. Elijah's rough hands tightened slightly around the paper before he lowered it back onto the workbench beside the cracked silver watch and yellowed photograph. Ava looked between the adults carefully, sensing the emotional gravity inside the room even if she could not fully explain it yet. Victoria Hale stood motionless beside Elijah now, close enough to see the exhaustion hidden behind his calm expression. Daniel Whitmore quietly folded his arms while giving Elijah space to absorb the truth slowly. My father knew your family before I did, Elijah said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. Daniel nodded once. Your father helped people without asking questions. Elijah stared at the document again. He never told me he put another family before his own. Daniel's expression softened immediately. I do not think he saw it that way. Outside, headlights reflected against puddles beside the line of black SUVs parked silently along the curb. Neighborhood windows still glowed nearby while curious shadows moved behind curtains. Yet inside Carter Auto Repair, the entire night had narrowed into memories passed quietly between fathers and sons across generations. Ava gently touched Elijah's sleeve again. Grandpa sounds like you. Elijah looked down at her slowly. The statement landed harder than anything else that evening. Victoria saw it immediately in his eyes. Because deep down Elijah had spent years worrying he was failing quietly as a father. Working too much. Missing school meetings. Stretching bills too thin. Hiding exhaustion behind steady routines so Ava never carried the weight with him. But now, standing inside the same garage built from sacrifice and inherited dignity, he suddenly realized something else. His daughter already saw the man he had been trying to become all along. Daniel stepped closer toward the old workbench. After your father passed away, my mother tried finding you for years. Elijah frowned slightly. Why? Daniel glanced briefly toward the photograph again. Because she believed your father saved us more than once. Victoria remained silent while listening carefully. Every revelation tonight peeled away another layer from the quiet mechanic she almost dismissed earlier that afternoon. Elijah leaned both hands against the workbench now, shoulders heavy beneath years of labor and responsibility. I barely remember those winters, he admitted quietly. Daniel smiled sadly. That is because your father protected you from them. Silence returned again after that. The kind filled with reflection instead of discomfort. Ava slowly picked up the cracked silver watch from beside the toolbox and held it carefully in both hands. Can it be fixed? She asked softly. Elijah looked at the stopped watch for several long seconds before answering. Maybe. Victoria noticed the subtle shift in his voice. For the first time all night, hope had entered it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet and cautious. Daniel reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed a folded set of papers secured beneath a leather clip. He placed them beside the beneficiary document without speaking immediately. Elijah glanced down at them cautiously. Daniel. Daniel interrupted gently. Just read them first. Rain softened outside now into a steady mist while fluorescent lights reflected across the wet garage floor. Elijah opened the documents slowly. Victoria leaned closer unconsciously beside him. Ava watched from near the toolbox holding the silver watch carefully against her chest. Elijah scanned the first page once. Then twice. His entire expression changed. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Victoria caught the company letterhead immediately. Whitmore Urban Development Holdings. Elijah looked up sharply toward Daniel. You cannot be serious. Daniel met his eyes calmly. I have never been more serious about anything. Elijah stared back down at the paperwork while thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The first line sat clearly beneath the legal header. Full ownership transfer proposal. Carter Auto Repair property and adjacent lots. Elijah Carter kept staring at the ownership transfer papers as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. The fluorescent lights above the garage flickered softly while rainwater continued dripping from the damaged corner of the roof into the metal bucket near the office wall. Full ownership transfer proposal. Carter Auto Repair property and adjacent lots. The document trembled faintly in his rough mechanic hands before he slowly lowered it onto the workbench beside the cracked silver watch and the faded beneficiary form signed by his father years earlier. Ava remained beside him quietly holding the old watch against her chest while Victoria Hale watched every subtle change in Elijah's expression. Daniel Whitmore stood calmly across from him, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. Not like a businessman negotiating. Like a man trying to finally honor something unfinished. Daniel, Elijah said quietly, this is too much. Daniel shook his head immediately. No. It is finally enough. Silence settled again inside the garage. Outside, the black SUVs remained lined beneath mist and streetlights while neighbors continued watching through glowing windows. But inside Carter Auto Repair, none of that mattered anymore. Victoria slowly stepped closer toward the paperwork resting on the workbench. She scanned the proposal quickly with trained executive eyes. Full debt clearance. Property restoration funding. Ownership protection clause. Long-term inheritance transfer to Ava Carter. Victoria looked up sharply toward Daniel after reading the final line. This was not charity. It was permanence. Elijah exhaled slowly before rubbing one hand across the back of his neck. I cannot take this from you. Daniel smiled faintly. You already did 11 years ago. Elijah shook his head again. I gave you a motel room and food. Daniel stepped closer. You gave me dignity when I had none left. The words settled heavily between them. Victoria felt the emotional truth of them immediately because she had spent years inside powerful rooms where dignity was usually attached to wealth, titles, or status. Elijah had offered it freely while barely surviving himself. Ava looked carefully between the two men. Does this mean we keep the garage forever? Elijah turned toward her slowly. His tired eyes softened immediately again. Maybe, he answered honestly. Daniel corrected him gently. Not maybe. Elijah looked back toward the paperwork while thunder rolled softly in the distance. Victoria noticed the conflict inside him clearly now. Pride. Gratitude. Fear. Men like Elijah survived by carrying burdens themselves. Accepting life-changing help felt almost painful because it challenged the identity built through years of silent sacrifice. Daniel seemed to understand that too. You do not owe me anything for this, he said quietly. Not your loyalty. Not your future. Nothing. Elijah gave a tired laugh beneath his breath. You sound like my father. Daniel smiled softly. That is probably the greatest compliment I will ever receive. Rain slowed outside into a soft mist now. One of the SUVs quietly drove away from the curb, headlights fading down the street while the neighborhood slowly returned toward normal life again. But inside the garage, time still felt suspended between past and future. Victoria crossed her arms loosely before speaking for the first time in several minutes. Most people spend their whole lives trying to become important, she said softly while looking directly at Elijah. You became unforgettable without even trying. Elijah looked uncomfortable immediately after hearing that. Ava smiled proudly beside him anyway. Daniel glanced toward the old toolbox, then toward the rows of worn equipment surrounding the garage. There is one condition though. Elijah frowned slightly. Condition? Daniel nodded once. You stop carrying this place alone. Elijah remained silent. Daniel continued carefully. Hire people. Fix the roof properly. Go home before midnight sometimes. Ava immediately smiled. Yes. Victoria laughed softly beneath her breath for the first time all evening. Elijah looked down at the paperwork again while rainwater tapped gently against the windows. For the first time in years, the future sitting in front of him no longer looked like another survival problem waiting to happen. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket one final time and placed a small brass key beside the transfer papers. Elijah stared at it quietly. What is that? Daniel smiled faintly. The building next door. Elijah Carter stared quietly at the small brass key resting beside the transfer papers while rain softened into a faint mist outside Carter Auto Repair. The garage no longer sounded heavy with tension now. Only tired. Warm. Honest. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while the old heater clicked beside the office wall. Ava stood close against Elijah's side holding the cracked silver watch carefully in both hands as though it belonged to the entire family now instead of just the past. Victoria Hale remained near the workbench watching Elijah with a completely different expression than the one she carried into the garage earlier that afternoon. Not judgment. Not distance. Respect. Daniel Whitmore smiled faintly after placing the brass key down beside the paperwork. The owner retired 6 months ago, he explained quietly. The building has been sitting empty. Elijah looked up slowly. Why would I need the place next door? Daniel glanced around the cramped garage filled with stacked tires, leaking shelves, old engine parts, and barely enough walking room between tool cabinets. Because this place stopped fitting your life years ago. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the key again without speaking. Victoria could almost see the internal battle happening behind his calm expression. Men like Elijah learned to survive by expecting very little. Every act of generosity felt dangerous because disappointment had usually arrived right behind it. Daniel seemed to understand that too. You do not have to answer tonight, he said gently. But your father built survival. You deserve the chance to build something more. Silence settled softly across the room again. Ava finally smiled toward her father. We could fix cars and have a real office. Elijah laughed quietly beneath his breath for the first time all evening. A real laugh. Small. Tired. Genuine. Victoria smiled without realizing it. Somehow that quiet sound changed the atmosphere more than the paperwork ever could. Outside, two of the black SUVs slowly pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the wet Atlanta streets beneath glowing traffic lights. The neighborhood had started calming down too. Curtains closed. Porch lights dimmed. Life moving forward again. But inside the garage, something permanent had already shifted. Elijah picked up the brass key carefully and turned it once between his fingers. You really carried all this for 11 years, he asked Daniel softly. Daniel nodded once. Some people forget where they came from after success. He glanced toward the old photograph beside the toolbox. I spent 11 years trying not to. Victoria looked toward Elijah then. Most people with power would have bulldozed this block without thinking twice. Daniel smiled faintly. I almost did. Elijah looked up sharply. Daniel continued honestly. Until I saw your name. Rain tapped gently against the windows while Ava carefully placed the silver watch back inside the wooden box beside the old photograph of Elijah's father. The gesture felt strangely symbolic. As if the past itself could finally rest now. Elijah leaned one hand against the old toolbox while staring around the garage slowly. Every stain on the concrete floor. Every dented cabinet. Every winter this place carried him through alone while raising Ava the best he could. He suddenly realized something important. He had spent years believing survival was the final goal. But maybe survival had only been the beginning. Victoria stepped closer beside him quietly. Your father would be proud of you. Elijah remained silent for several seconds before answering softly. I hope Ava will be too someday. Ava immediately wrapped both arms around his waist before he even finished speaking. I already am. The words hit him harder than anything else that night. Victoria looked away briefly to hide the emotion rising in her own eyes. Daniel smiled quietly toward the floor. Elijah rested one rough hand gently against Ava's hair while the garage fell silent once more beneath warm fluorescent light and fading rain. No applause. No dramatic speeches. Just a tired black father standing inside the small garage that carried generations of sacrifice and dignity. Outside, the city kept moving without noticing what had happened here tonight. But inside Carter Auto Repair, something rare had survived long enough to change everything. Not money. Not power.